Good morning and welcome everyone to the 2020 BSI Standards e-conference and awards. Thank you all for joining us from wherever you are in the world for what we hope is going to be a fantastic conference. My name is David Bell. I'm the Director of Standards Policy at BSI, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this conference. And we'd especially like to thank all of our speakers, our panelists, our exhibitors who've given up their time to share their expertise with us over the next 3 days. Hopefully you've all been using the guidebook app and web platform that we developed to support the delivery of the conference and that you had no trouble accessing the session this morning. So some tips and reminders to help you get the most out of the event. This year we'll be using 2 providers to deliver the conference, Guidebook and Zoom. The Standards Conference and Awards mobile app and web platform are with Guidebook, and all the conference sessions, including the meetings with exhibitors, are via Zoom. The mobile app will allow you to create a profile, build your own schedule, read about exhibitors and speakers, and most importantly, the app is where you can interact to help you in making connections and allow others to connect with you. So we recommend that you complete your profile in the mobile app. The Guidebook web platform will have all of the details about the conference program, about the speakers and the exhibitors, and the build your own schedule feature is there. So to join any of the sessions, go into the Guidebook platform and you'll find links to access the live Zoom sessions over the next 3 days. During the live sessions, you can interact via the Zoom Q&A. During the sessions, you can interact via the Q&A and chat functions. The speakers or the hosts for each session will let you know which is being used, and you can access these via the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. For this opening session, feel free to post comments in the chat, but please submit all questions via the Q&A facility. Now, because of the number of participants, your video and your microphone will be off, except in the Knowledge Marketplace meetings. And for reasons of security and privacy and capacity, we ask that you please don't forward any links, Guidebook or Zoom to anyone. These are for the registered participants only. If you've not already done so, please contact the exhibitors you'd like to visit to pre-book your one-to-one chat with them during the Knowledge Marketplace sessions. Details for booking can be found on the Guidebook app and web platform by clicking on the exhibitor's logo, and only those with appointments will receive links for exhibitor meetings. So to the content, this year's conference is split into 2 main streams. Later we will look at the world of standards. Now that stream includes sessions on the future of standards to support UK regulations after the end of this year. We'll also have a keynote speech from the ISO Secretary General, Sergio Mujica, about ISO's new strategy and developments in the organization. We'll also present the 2020 Standards Awards, where we'll hear some impressive stories about how standards are being developed and being used through the pandemic. But first up, we're going to look at how standards can support building back better post-COVID. And I'm pleased to introduce now our first keynote speaker. Our first keynote speaker is a recognized and respected thought leader in tech and a trustee in the Institute for the Future of Work. Anne-Marie Imafidon has spoken across the globe for some of the world's biggest digital companies and conferences, and she was voted the most influential woman in tech in the UK in 2020 by Computer Weekly. So a very warm welcome to Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, the floor is yours. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie, for the presentation. Let's move to the panel discussion where there'll be more chance to ask Anne-Marie some questions. And we're going to focus now on building back better and exploring more of what that means and the role of standards. And I'm pleased to be joined by some eminent panelists. And I want to start with Stéphane Dubois. Stéphane, I hope you are there. You can hear me. Stéphane is the manager of the Gender and Growth Initiative at Chatham House. So if I can come to you first, Stéphane, you and Elizabeth Eisel recently published an action plan for how women's experience and expertise will drive economic recovery. Could you tell us more about that, about how that will happen?
Yes, I can. Can you see me? I mean, that's the first question people ask when they start on a Zoom.
Perfectly.
Can you see me? Good. Okay, so I first would like to say that I found Anne-Marie's talk absolutely fascinating. When I first saw her at Chatham House a few years ago, I thought, I want her to be my next best friend. The way she sees the world, the way she just takes it on board is absolutely amazing. Anyway, um, how did we start? I'm really pleased to be with you because I think that standards can help put in place and implement correctly the recommendations that we have in the plan. We started off in the spring by saying, oh God, this is really dramatic. The effect the pandemic is having on women is extraordinary, and what are we going to do about it? Um, the next phase came when we started hearing people saying, well, wait a minute, hang on a minute. Could that not be the once in a lifetime opportunity to reset the world, to see how we can do things differently, we could be more equal, we can be more inclusive, and we can readjust things. We realize things aren't working the way we'd like them to work. What can we do? Women were particularly affected. I'm going to go down several notches right now after the talk by Anne-Marie, but I would say that women were particularly particularly in when we saw the lockdown. We could see how we weren't prepared for this. I'm sorry, there's some work being done on the building. I hope it doesn't disturb you in terms of the sound. It shouldn't be too long. But women were affected because they were in customer facing roles, because immediately in tourism, in retail, care jobs, public administration, the arts, and whatever, whether in the formal or informal economy, they had to stay home and couldn't take their work home. They earned less than their male counterparts, so they had less leverage. They had smaller pensions if they were older. They were less insured. These are general elements, but also one has to remember that they are responsible for the bulk of the unpaid care and domestic work. So we thought, let's bring people together. We brought just under 90 experts and thought leaders from from all continents except Antarctica, obviously, but they represented the private sector, corporations and small entrepreneurs, government officials, international organizations, civil society, and we had a series of roundtables to see how we could address these challenges, and under the title Beyond the Pandemic, Designing the Roadmap for a Gender Equal World. So the strategic plan, which I think the link was put in the chat by Stephanie, focuses on three big themes. One is investment in care and social protection. The second one is making sure that women's competencies are aligned with market needs. So that's skilling, upskilling, and reskilling, but not only formal education. You have to think in terms of vocational and professional education, and also investing on the development of women-owned businesses. With so many women finding themselves without a job due to COVID-19, the potential to promote women-owned businesses, startups, especially in e-commerce, is huge. So the first point was women must be included at every stage of decision-making process, particularly when it comes to stimulus packages. If you go back to the Prime Minister's speech in June this year, when he announced a New Deal, it was all focused. I mean, you remember the slogan was "Build, Build, Build." So there's this impression that investing in physical infrastructure is the only way to go and the only way to create jobs, when it's been proven that if you invest in social infrastructure, you are creating jobs also, and you're ensuring resilience and preparedness. So the investment in social infrastructure should be at least equally important as physical infrastructure. So the message, I would say, if I have to summarize the strategic action plan, so the message is make it possible for women to help you build back better. You need women to be in the workforce. You need for families, in the context of the pandemic, if you don't have formal childcare or adult care, the economies will struggle because parents, especially mothers, and I have to say, I know some men are also stay-at-home fathers, but mothers will not be able to go back to work. It's one staggering figure is that in September alone, almost 1 million women in the US have dropped out of the workforce so that they could take care of their family responsibilities. So it is serious. What can, I mean, many of the recommendations we have in the plan are designed for or aiming at governments, but there is a role that the private sector can play in terms of partnering or collaborating or developing childcare and family-friendly policies that will allow them to attract the female talent and maintain and retain this talent. So, you know, I can get into a few examples in terms of childcare. For instance, there's a medical clinic in Germany that partnered with the city to build a new creche. So the company behind the clinic provided the land and paid for most of the construction costs. And the city then leased the property for 25 years, took up the responsibility for the operations, including the employment of the childcare teachers. We've seen in Brazil NGOs partnering with employers and governments to provide care. In India's IT sector and parks, companies have set up consortiums to co-invest and share care responsibilities for the employers. I'm getting very distracted by this noise. I'm really sorry. I don't know how much this is. But in terms of the family-friendly policies that have been consistently recognized as helping and really being attractive. First of all, they should not be presented as women's benefits. They should be there for families. So paid family caregiving is really important. Childcare reimbursement benefits is also important. The equivalent of a referral service for childcare and elder care, sometimes good. Parental transition coaching programs, that will guide employees and their managers before and just after returning from parental leave and from 1 to 5 years after the parental leave. Backup childcare, leave policies that are both for full-time and part-time employees. And I hope that this would all help convince. I mean, there's a poll that was done recently by the Women's Budget Group, and this was in the UK, and I think it is quite interesting to see that 4 in 5 of all respondents, about 75%, and 3 in 4 men agree that women and men should share care tasks for children and or older disabled relative equally. And that the government, 60%, 66% agreed that the government should encourage and finally support men to provide more care. And when, anyway, all that to say that there's one of the roundtables that was fascinating, and it was on shifting social norms. It was impossible because it's longer term, and this is an action plan. This is something we have to come back to, because it is only by shifting social norms that we'll be able to change things. Now, what can standards do, I would say, to allow us to implement and make sure that these are taken into consideration by companies? I've skipped all the women-owned businesses, although for the private sector, it's really important to ensure that you have a good supply chain. Companies can do something in terms of their gender inclusive procurement policies, or they can have them because they will increase sourcing from women-owned businesses. Banks and institutions can increase their credit lines and investment and make sure that that the funds that governments dedicate to support micro and small and medium enterprises also go to women-owned businesses in a proportion that is equal to their prevalence in the market. So Training, very important. Digital and financial inclusion, extremely important. Voilà. Let's stop there and see what we can do here. And happy to answer, as many questions as you have.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm sure people have questions and they'll put them in the Q&A, and we'll come back to you on that as well in a second. But let me just introduce the other two panelists, starting with Sadie Dainton. Sadie Dainton is BSI's Consumer Policy Manager, so responsible for bringing consumer voices into the standards development process. Now, Sadie, there have been multiple overnight changes for consumers due to the pandemic. What does better mean when we talk about building back better? What does better mean for consumers, and how can standards help?
Thanks, David. I think what I'd like to sort of build back on is what Anne-Marie and Stefan have said. And that's around, I think the most important thing is representation. I think that consumers, we've seen over the pandemic that business were really in as much shock as consumers about how to continue to communicate and engage with consumers. And I think there's we've seen from research from McKinsey in the UK and also Kantar globally that really there's been a crisis of trust in the consumer world because they suddenly companies shut down speaking to them, and this has sort of led to this sort of crisis in confidence and an inability to live life as they were, to choose to go to a store or to choose to go to their local authorities or their doctors. Didn't matter which service it was, suddenly this sort of communication stopped. And looking at the increase in use in digital technology, it's gone up about 30% in the UK. But this has also, it's led to two things. It's led to consumers realizing there's a lot more choice out there and that they don't necessarily have to stay loyal to the businesses they're working with. And that could be because they were inaccessible or because the way those businesses responded, they hadn't built in that resilience. Although the digital world's been here for a long time, Anne-Marie was talking 10 years ago around, digital's been around a long while, but still consumers haven't been listened to. When I say consumers, I mean everyone in society that interacts through a digital space. And I think that looking at that, it's meant that in the UK there are many more vulnerable consumers because consumers have had to suddenly communicate through online, and their ability to interface has been much restricted. And I think that that's developed a huge new range of vulnerability. So not just the people who were already vulnerable and already having difficulties in speaking to business and feeling they were being listened to. And I talk particularly about, say, essential services. But now with the pandemic and the suddenly, sort of, as you say, multiple changes overnight, people who were much older or weren't connected or didn't want to be connected suddenly had their ability to feed back to business about what was going wrong or how something they were doing was impacting them has really gone away. I think there's two other things I'd like to mention about how the sort of pandemic has impacted consumers or affected them. And one is that consumers have really created this empathy for other consumers. And so not only are they now choosing to deal with businesses because it's a good price or because it's on their doorstep, they've also been looking at how those businesses have been treating their employees. There's been something like a 15% increase in consumer choice, and actually take into account how have business been treating their employees and how have business been showing that they're sustainable. And I think even something, if you look at the ads on the television at the moment, business are trying to respond by showing that they care, and showing that it's not all about money, it's about caring for the community. It's showing that they treat their employees well in their workspace, showing diversity in their workplace, and understanding that consumers are actually looking at this as one of the factors of why they would trust that business. And I think without that consumer trust, this is where things go wrong. So I think for me, building back better means that business, well, all organizations really have to look at how they operate in a much broader space. So it's not only just their customers that they need to be looking at, they have to be looking at how they're impacting consumers as a whole. If they're not acting in a sustainable way, they're not only being criticized by their customers, they're being sort of held to account by other consumers who have that impact. And I think, your question about standards and what can standards do, I think standards need to continue to improve. We've seen I've been involved in the consumer movement and with standard for over 30 years, and certainly things have changed dramatically from when I was the only consumer on the pitch, and that you were full of a room full of white middle-aged men, and you turn up and start trying to say, but this isn't how it's done. I think there's been huge steps, but I think there's still a long way to go. And I think representation is key, and not just representation of consumers. And we're lucky at BSI, we have the Consumer and Public Interest Network. We have great consumer expert volunteers that specifically bring the consumer voice into standards, and they are working alongside and with a broad range of consumer organisations who represent, for instance, an Age UK. We need to know what the problems older people are having, working with Scope, people with disabilities, working with Child Accident Prevention Trust. What about children? So it's really, I think, through the consumer voice, but I would hope in an equally diverse way, more and more different organisations, if they can come and speak and bring to attention in that committee where you're there as an equal stakeholder. And it's really, really important that we continue to find better ways and easier ways for those really important stakeholders to bring that voice to benefit business and government, because the consumers and the people who are having these different experiences are exactly the ones who can help business and help government understand how to be more resilient. What changes do you need to make? What is good practice, not only for business, but in the eyes of those consumers that are in the end within their supply chain at some point, however far you are along the supply chain, at some point your product will impact or influence a consumer. And I think that's the important thing to remember, that across that spectrum, whether you be designing something for marine shipping and think this has nothing to do with consumers, you're impacting those consumers at each port that it arrives at. And if you go to the other extreme, the circular economy, recycling, at some point your consumers are going to have to recycle those products. And so how can we help, and how can standards help consumers do the right thing at the right time, but also be able to feed in along the whole process to make sure, as Anne-Marie was mentioning with AI, it's great, but if you haven't got someone at the beginning to say, but here's a pitfall, here's an unintended consequence, have you checked this, then at the end your products and your business isn't going to be as good as it can.
Sadie, and it's a good segue into our fourth panelist, which is David Fatscher, BSI's Head of Sector for Environment, Social and Governance. So David, the pandemic has brought into stark relief the concerns about social responsibility, about the environment. So in this year, with COP26 looming, what does better look like in the world of sustainability and social responsibility, and where are standards helping in those areas?
Thanks, David, and great to join you. I think the phrase "Build Back Better" we've heard a lot in the last 6 months. We've heard it a few times today, and I guess I buy into that. I think it's important, but there's always a worry, almost picking up on the keynote, as to who determines what better is. And I think one phrase I've heard, which I think is relevant to this conversation more recently, is we're now in a sort of transition from system shock to potential system change. It gets much more into the kind of the DNA of the actual issue, I think. And I think that the pandemic, in a way, has just helped foreshadow some of the strains that in the next 10 years, the climate emergency is going to be sort of presenting us with. So what I hope has happened, and is beginning to happen, is that organizations are realizing they need to pivot, and pretty quickly pivot, towards a more agile business culture. Those that have done, I think, have responded quite well to the last 6 months, and maybe they're recognizing, and others are recognizing, that's what they need to do. So that more agile business culture, I think, is important, where they can respond to the ESG indicators that are now quite mainstream. So in that sense, what standards we have both developed previously and are developing now, I think, are highly relevant in this area of building back better, or putting down the building blocks of some of that system change we've been hearing about. So across environment, for example, UK has been leading a lot of this work now for 20 years or so in terms of environmental risk management and mitigation, but increasingly also responding to climate change adaptation. So it's gone beyond just mitigation. It's now, how can we actually, as I said, develop business models that actually are responding to the climate emergency. So great work from UK experts in ISO there, both last year and coming up as well. And I think in terms of the sort of the more social area, we're developing British standards on how social value can be assessed. That's very important, with UK legislation now putting an obligation on public sector bodies to actually award contracts, or factor in the award of contracts the social value, rather than just cheapest contract wins. That's really important. I know two colleagues of mine are talking about new work that's happening on community resilience. That's Dave Adamson later, and also some work that's being led in part on the back of BSI work on safe working in a kind of post-COVID environment. But also picking up on what we've heard a lot about, I think, this morning, the broader kind of governance piece about how diversity, inclusivity can be sort of embedded in organizations as part of their culture, rather than just a kind of plug-in or an add-on as well. So there's some work that BSI has done historically there, which is now informing ISO work. I noticed that, I think on the chat, Wilson was mentioning I'm going to remind myself what it is, Wilson, the new ISO on valuing diversity and inclusivity, ISO 30415. But BSI has previously published a British standard on a similar topic. And also, again, it got referenced earlier on, but it's really important, I think, for employers to realise what's happened in the last 6 months in terms of the impact of home working and the stresses and strains it's put on people, psychological health and safety. So again, BSI has led a lot of work on health and safety historically in developing British standards and ISO work as well. But there is some, as an ISO standard on psychological health and safety, but there's a BSI PAS going back, I think, maybe 5+ years on managing social risk in the workplace. So I think both there's interesting work coming in response to this. I think it's demonstrating maybe that organizations are recognizing and beginning to embrace that more agile and responsive business culture. I think it's a case really of where UK's done some great work, leadership, and is building on that now in ISO, and so more standards to come in this area.
David, so a few questions that have come in, and just to remind people that we can't take questions live in the sense of putting your hand up, so please do type them in the Q&A function. And just looking at a couple of other areas of discrimination, I might bring Anne-Marie in on this. There's one question from Simon Atkin about tech terms that could be seen to be providing subliminal messages around whitelisting and blacklisting, and what more can we do there? And there was a question earlier from Linda Cooper about ageism bias. Anne-Marie, do you want to go first on that tech question?
Yeah, so to Simon's tech question, I think kind of this is the Uncle Ben's example, right? I think there was quite a big uproar when they changed it from kind of Uncle Ben's. I think they called it Ben's Original, and kind of the Twitter sphere was a bit like, okay, cool. I mean, that's good, but it's not necessarily what we've asked for. So I think we have to be careful that we don't, all these things are important, and getting around to all of them will be great. But I think, changing it from blacklisting and whitelisting to allow list and deny list is definitely going to help. But I think hiring people and paying them fairly is probably what they want above some of those. So I think we have to be careful. We have to make sure that we're doing things that mean something. And it does contribute to belonging, but which helps someone belong more? Is it paying them properly and actually hiring them into your organization, or is it changing a couple of terms? So I think it's not one or the other, but it's being able to prioritize and say, okay, cool, I can pay someone who can then be in that meeting, and then they can say, okay, we're going to change this to deny and allow list, or whatever you're going to change it to. But I would much rather be hired and employed. And I think on Linda's question about ageism, I think it's all of them. And I want to draw this in. There was another comment that came through, I think just to the panelists, about being a BSI CEN and ISO convener. My committees do not see man or woman, but standards for industry. And I think it's interesting. We kind of, it's even this thing of being colorblind, right? I don't see race. And it's like, you can't, that's not how you do equitable practice. You have to take all of the aspects of who that person is and what they might have and who you might have in that space. And you need to say, okay, because they are a woman, society has dictated that means that they're more likely to be doing the care. And so we have to see that there are different types of folks that we might have. So I don't think it's good enough for us to say we're going to be blind to it. We have to kind of consider all the difference, whether it's age, whatever those protected characteristics and beyond might be. I think we do have to be conscious about ensuring that's all part of what we do in our hiring decisions. That's why I always go back: hiring decisions, promotion decisions, positions of responsibility. In each of those, how are we making the right discussion?
And Stefan, you might come in on the question that Andrea Bedard-Smith has raised about how picking up the World Bank president's comment about starting and growing a business being one of the most powerful tools for women, and how we can get this to happen. Is that how you see it as well? Do you concur with the view of the World Bank president?
I think very often people do not have the choice. There are many people who do it because they need to find a source of income. So if you take the women in Mexico selling tortillas on the side of the street, this is a businesswoman. It is a very, very, very small scale, but it is a businesswoman. And it's because that's the way she can earn money for her family. So to allow the people who have already started. Another thing also, during the financial crisis in the United States, a huge number of Black women started businesses because they weren't getting jobs. Now they've been affected even more than other businesses, and we'll see what happens in the second with this economic crisis linked to COVID. But yes, I agree. We need to move away from some of the barriers that are regulatory, that are discriminatory, such as inheritance laws in certain countries, not being able to own property, having to have a signature of your husband if you have a business. All these small elements that seem like nothing will give women the independence to start their business and to move ahead. But training, making sure that you've got the proper information, that you ensure that investors look at women, because right now they're just no, we're blind. We were talking about the blindness of investors, but women-owned businesses have a very hard time accessing finance. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't incentivize investors to look into it, you're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. So it's about
examples.
For example, yeah. David, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, actually picking up on Stefan's point, I mean, that's some work we're doing actually on sustainable and responsible finance, and recognizing that the role that ESG indicators are increasingly playing in terms of where investors now are viewing, the right horse to back, as it were. But a sort of stat I read at the weekend actually was interesting. I mean, it's maybe not a surprise, but by 2029, the millennial and Gen Z or Gen Z generations will make up 72% of the world's workforce, compared to 52% last year. I mean, I guess that's inevitable with any kind of generational sort of sweep across the market. But I think, given that we know that the millennial generation are more likely to be motivated in terms of where they both shop, which is partly to Sadie's point, but also where they work by kind of the ESG indicators and credentials. I think that is a positive sign, and I think it addresses maybe some of the points we've been talking about today. And the point I didn't make earlier on is, with everything I was talking about, whether it's to do with psychological health and safety or social value, there's this kind of big wrapper you can put around that, which is about purpose. And I think there is some work that BSI is having conversations with different sectors about how can purpose be really sort of embedded into the organizational culture, form part of the DNA. So that's an area where people on this call maybe don't really think of standards as being a natural kind of fit, because they think of maybe quantification techniques and everything else we've done historically. But I think this idea of principles and values is where standards can increasingly play a role, because it can be outcomes based. It's not a pass-fail test criteria, but it's more about these are the principles of purpose, and if you hold that mirror up to your organization, how do you sort of shape up against that, and what changes can you make to start to sort of transform into a more 21st century future fit organization.
We did get a question there from Paul Robbins about essentially linking the performance of an organization to its CSR policies. And I don't know whether one of you want to come in on that. Do we see in the future that actually we'll be directly able to track the company's performance by its adherence to positive and progressive CSR policies? Is the business driver going to change post-COVID, do you think, to be much more progressive in their CSR outlook? Who'd like to come in on that one? Anne-Marie.
I think when I initially saw that question, I thought it was interesting, because I think so David's just kind of brought it back up. How do we define success? How do we define better? And if you've got the idea of the triple bottom line, so it means that it's not just about Marks and Spencer's sales, it's all the other measures of success. So I don't know that it's just about more money for the stakeholders, right? I think we need to go beyond that. I felt like we've already gone beyond that as the sole measure of success. That's kind of my initial reaction, but yeah.
And you've certainly seen that with ethical finance. I mean, that's this is a real challenge for ethical investments to make sure that they're following the CSR policies.
But having social, like the social profit, right? So it's not just about the more money. So with any of the social investments, so this happened when I was at Deutsche. Kind of the social investments is, there's a knock-on effect, or there's a cost of. I think it was the Peterborough Jail was one of the first examples they had, where investing in, whatever social business it was that was doing the rehabilitation meant that then less was spent on those prisoners and having those people reoffending. So it's not just a direct, you made more money, it's what's the net effect kind of across society. So what are the different ways that we measure what success might be, given that it isn't just about, Marks and Sparks selling more, leggings or whatever it is.
Yeah, it was, again, picking up on the Marks and Spencer's one, a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I went to M&S used to have almost like an open meeting of stakeholders, which was, I think, the day before the chief exec had to go to the board and basically, reveal what the performance was, and then go to the city and everything. And it was interesting. They got the I forget who the chief exec was then, actually. It might have been Mark Boland, but getting quite a grilling from some financial journalists in terms of, your numbers aren't great. Are you now going to change course? And both he and the then sort of head of their sustainability program, who people probably know, Mike Barry, said, no, we're not changing course because this matters to us. Now, I don't know intimately, M&S's current share price and whether they are, but I think I was very persuaded by the fact that they said, oh, this is part of the culture of this organization. We will continue to manage supply chains in an ethical way. We'll continue to invest in renewable energy. We'll continue to make sure that staff's, uniforms are made out of recycled bottles, because that matters to us. And I think that's maybe, they're often held up as one of those organizations that had, when they set up the sort of Plan A manifesto, as it were, it was about putting purpose first. So I think that's very, I guess they probably have struggled in some of their businesses, particularly the clothesline, maybe food less so, but they seem to be very committed to that. And I think that's quite a noble cause. And others, I think, are following as well.
Sadie, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think, going back to what I was saying earlier about consumers shifting their behavior and being able to actually have this time to think about what's really important to them. And I know that business want to do the right thing, but also that is ultimately, I think, driven by consumers and what they see as the right thing. So I think we've seen, certainly, I was reading, food and drink business are talking about using this window of opportunity to advocate for not only a sustainable framework, but to build back in a way that meets the expectations of consumers and political expectations. And I think we saw in the pandemic the reaction of consumers to, for instance, in the fashion industry, when suddenly UK retailers cut off their supply chain and stopped orders in Bangladesh and Pakistan and around the world, that consumers did not like that at all, and they reacted very strongly. They reacted strongly when it came out about maybe employers not treating their employees right in, say, factories in Leicester. So I think, that's why I think it's really important to have this consumer voice. And when I say consumer, I mean that in the broadest sense. People, representative voices from throughout society in these conversations. I don't think business can build back better without having that advocacy, because as much as you can use research and data, they're not at the table to advocate for that. You need the people themselves, whether it be from the BAME community, whether it be from environmental organizations, whether it be from the consumers who are in the midst, at the heart of all these issues. I think this is a really important thing, and this is why I think standards actually gives that opportunity to those organizations to come and sit at the table. We have to find a way of making it very clear that they're welcome and that they can make a great contribution to so that these business organizations can be very clear about what does good look like, because without that sort of guidance, particularly for SMEs, etc., they need that clear guidance, and for that we need to make sure the message has taken into account all those different stakeholders.
Stefan, did you want to come in there? Yeah, please.
Yes, just to follow up on what Sadie said, there's something that we tend to forget, is that, for instance, in the G20 countries, overall, women make about 80% of family financial decisions or spending. So they have a role to play as consumers to push to see a change in policies. They don't always feel that they have this power, but they do make the decision regarding food, regarding et cetera, et cetera. There was a question that was asked earlier about leveling the playing field because everybody got into more flexible work. I recently heard that apparently right now men have 3 times more chances of getting promoted right now than women do. Without being in the office or not being in office, they just have more chances of being there, and they have more time if they're doing less of the homeschooling and domestic and care work. So solving the problem of unpaid domestic and care work is extremely important. So there are different elements that we can work on. I have a question for this august audience of standards, of people focusing on standards. I've given you an idea of what's in the strategic plan. Can you see standards helping put these in place? Because we feel this would be transformative. This would bring us to a more equal world. Are there standards that we could in place in terms of hiring practices, in terms of making family life compatible with working life? Anything we can do about women entrepreneur? Anything that we can do? Would standards help? Voluntary standards, but obviously they'd need to be, from what I understand, monitored, so that make sure that people are following them.
Well, that's a challenge back to BSI and to the audience there. David, did you want to come in on that? Because there are I know a number of standards out there, and Tom Stewart's highlighted international standard there on human-centered organization that talks about 7 principles that make organizations more human-centered. And there is a question that's just come in from Peter Hebert from IMechE about the decisions that BSI takes and whether it's based on engineering essentially, or whether it's driven by something else. And the face coverings one is a very hot potato right now. Do you want to come in there?
I was just reading partly that question actually, so I did hear what Stefan was saying. I think in a way, possibly back to the point I made before, which is I think that our sort of catalogue of standards will always need to address all the needs of standards users, which is both for measurement techniques, but also I think increasingly the fact that principles and values are what drives organization and organizational change. So we are definitely moving as an organization to respond to that. And I think that's probably, in a way, there's a bit of a chicken egg thing here, isn't it? Therefore, that also speaks to the fact that we need to look at who we recruit into standardization, because therefore, if we continue to have people who are purely able to sort of look at a solution in technical terms, whilst that's very appropriate sometimes, it's not maybe the human aspect that we're talking about. So I mean, I remember when I was engaging with the energy systems catapult, about next generation technologies in terms of batteries and the like, but it was also addressing the issue of energy poverty. And I remember the head of the energy systems catapult saying, when I came into this job, I thought I'd only be recruiting technologists, but I see I have to recruit sociologists as well. So I think even an area like energy and energy tech, it's also, maybe to Sadie's point as well, about recognizing that you can't leave people behind with technology. I think therefore standardization needs to respond to that in a completely holistic way. If that's partly your question, I'm not sure.
Well, Stefan specifically asking about how we can, through voluntary standards, drive change or encourage change through the supply chain, which I think, if I'm wearing my BSI hat, that's certainly something that standards are there to do. Perhaps, Anne-Marie, we could just bring you in, because there was a question to you about your familiarity with standards and whether you've worked with them in the past, and whether you, like David's just said there, you only see the value essentially based on the inputs to that process. So where the inputs to the process are representative of the community there to serve, that's where you see the best outcomes.
I think definitely. I think with standards, I've been, since I saw that question, I've been trying to see if I can find like the number on a standard that we've used.
Don't worry about that.
How but I think so. Yeah, for me, kind of using standards in Stemettes work, for example, there's lots that we do around kind of child safety, safeguarding, technical standards as well. So I think for us, it's always about there's things you'll forget because you're only human, and so having a standard is always a good thing, almost like a fail safe, or almost like a checklist to be like, okay, cool, has it done this? Has it met that standard? So I think standards are really good for that. And in terms of the point that David was just making, I think this is something. So I kind of was reading and trying to reread the question. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there, which is, there's it's always been, or we've ended up always prioritizing technical prowess and technical competency over the fact that we only have these standards for human beings. So you can't completely abstract them out because of the sake of engineering. And that's kind of how we've got to where we are now, right? It's by forgetting who it was for and valuing that technical competency far too much, if you ask me. A lot of this, not to do you down, not to do engineers down. I'm a computer scientist myself. I wasn't born doing computer science. I learned it. It was a skill I learned and use it to apply to different things. And so we can't, this almost hierarchy we have that I'm technical, therefore I'm the only person that should be allowed to import into the standards, is killing us, literally. So I think it's quite important to kind of be able to value the difference and say, the standards is the standard, or whatever you've built is only as useful as people are going to be able to use it and implement it, but also as safe as it's going to keep different types of people. And if you lose sight of that, as nice as that is from an engineering point of view, we're not engineering for engineering's sake. So I think it's important, always important to remember that. Yeah.
It'd be great, actually, just to come back to Stefan's point and picking up exactly that we're not just doing this for engineers. This is about society. it'd be great to take a further look at your strategy document and see where standards can play a role there, because I'm just reading it. It talks about focusing on gender equality could add $13 trillion to the global GDP by 2030. You want to just say something about that, because I think that's people's ears certainly prick up when you talk about that impact.
This was something that came out a couple of years ago through a McKinsey report, and it is staggering figures. So what you'd think is that everybody would move to include more women in the workforce. I mean, that sort of makes sense, and that's what you would do. But apparently people don't follow data, or at least that kind of data. So what is it? I mean, what we tried to see is how are we going to, I mean, you can say women come and work, but if you have no childcare, you've got a problem. So there are certain things that need to be put in place. Somebody asked a question about linked to the World Bank. You need to make sure that women can create businesses. You need to make sure that they can travel. You need to make sure all sorts of things. But I do think that as I was listening to the conversation, that I should sit down with the people from BSI and see, okay, so which standards would help us implement some of the recommendations we've got there, because most companies would follow these standards, and it would be easy to say, okay, number XYZ, this you have to follow to get there. But again, it's quite extraordinary to think that you could add so much money to the global GDP, and companies are still moving very quickly. I think the whole notion of diversity in terms of boards, in terms of management, in terms of composition of your workforce is important at all levels. And when I was saying at the beginning, whatever plan you come up with will work only if women are sitting at the table.
Mm-hmm. I see in the chat that so absolutely, that's about the inputs into the process. They've got to be our process as well as into businesses. Nigel Carter in the chat talks about the fair trade movement, which is all about voluntary standards that have driven organizations to make certain changes, although there's some controversy about it, but they've made certain changes to change their behaviors. So maybe there's another question that's just come in about the role of business organizations like the CBI in supporting standards. I don't know whether, David, that's something you might want to pick up.
Yeah, I mean, so we do have a relationship with the CBI. I mean, organisations like the CBI will sit on our committees, because obviously that it's important for them to become aware of standards as they're developing, and it helps them provide input and shape the outcome itself. I think this is part of our ongoing engagement with industry groups like the CBI and IOD, and then obviously there are sector lenses you can apply to that as well, which is central really to how we can sort of mainstream what we're doing into those kind of bodies that perhaps are less familiar with what we're active in. And again, I think it comes back to that point, and I've said this on many different fora before, that in the S in BSI means standards, and to a lot of people that means just technical product specifications. So with an organisation like the CBI addressing all the different challenges that the 21st century workforce are having to wrestle with, and boardrooms are wrestling with, but perhaps they don't always, with a few exceptions that we know about at the CBI, turn to BSI as a knowledge partner. And I think it's the onus is on us to continue working with organisations like CBI to make sure that. I think this is what Stefan's saying, and I'd love to talk to you, Stefan, about how we can map our programme against what you're talking about. But it's how we can realise that we're talking here about knowledge solutions and tools that can really help transform businesses in the decade of action, as it's being called, the 2020s. So I think it's really important that we continue to have quite a strategic engagement with organisations like the CBI, not just at a committee level, but actually across our sort of outreach with organisations like CBI.
Great. And Stefan, yes.
I'm not quite sure how much time we've got left in the session, but I just want to. What was fascinating during the process to develop this strategic action plan were these examples that were coming from all over the world in terms of initiatives that are in place, and that people have really thought outside the box to be able, or have picked up on things that exist already. So if you have in India a number of women who are registering their house for Airbnb, it puts them in the financial and digital inclusion automatically because they have to be part of it. It encourages them to learn languages. It forces also people will want to see different traditions when they visit in rural India or rural Africa. So it forces people to also focus on the different traditions that they have and try to reinvigorate them, let's say, with the younger people, etc., etc. But there's one example that is always that comes back as an example of what you can do, and it can apply to inner cities or a different context. It's in India, Barefoot College International and the Solar Mamas. Don't know if you've heard about it, but it is basically training illiterate and semi-literate women, older women, to become solar engineers. So how do they do it? Technically, they can, it's the color coding, it's sign language, and it worked in India. And they started bringing women from other countries, so women from Guatemala, from Africa, and all that. And in Tanzania, recently, the president of Tanzania has encouraged the government to hire some of these solar mamas because of the efficiency, and so that they become part of the government employees. So how can we use these examples to translate that into different economies or different geographies? Is it possible? But I think the strategic plan is also a way to start a conversation. There are numerous examples, and I'm sure that in the UK there are examples in communities of things that are done, and they're not necessarily in the strategic action plan. But an example in Kenya, journalists picked up the strategic action plan, didn't say much about it, but it allowed them to highlight what they're doing in terms of working with technologies and banks and so on and so forth. And that's perfect. People need to talk about these initiatives so you can see if they can be applied in other geographies.
I'm going to come to each of you in a second just to ask you for your takeaway thought about what you'd like to see different in the post-COVID world and where you think standards can play a role. But before that, Anne-Marie, there's just talking again about bringing the right people to the table to prevent the impact of unconscious bias. We work a lot with big associations, all of which have got their diversity agendas that they're working on, but there are also specific organizations that are very focused on diversity or on specific groups, whether that's young professionals, whether it's BAME groups, whether it's women in particular industries. How do you see the relative strengths of those organizations? Do you think they both have a role to play?
Yeah, I think all of them have a role to play. And I think it's almost, it's not quite a union, but it's that idea of kind of strength in numbers that you do get with people being able to join groups like that, where they do feel more of a sense of belonging. So I think they're definitely great as listening devices, if nothing else, being tapped into those communities, hearing their pain points, hearing their considerations, hearing their paths is definitely something that those who are either creating standards or, those in leadership are able to do if they're not listening to those people in their own organizations, or if they don't have enough in their own organizations to be able to listen to. So I think there's definitely a great opportunity there. Also for recruitment, I think partnering up with those kinds of smaller communities and those affinity groups, I guess you could call them, is definitely a really high value thing to do. And I'd say kind of don't make it purely transactional. There are lots of organizations who say we kind of wanted to just post on their job board or just wanted to be at that event. And it's like, no, build and nurture a relationship. Mm-hmm. So it's not just when you're trying to hire, or not just when you're wanting to have a female face on something that you reach out to them, be a part of what's going on and see how you can seed those opportunities from one side to the other. So yeah, take a long-term approach. Don't take more than you're giving into those organizations as well, because a lot of them operate on a voluntary basis. A lot of people sacrificing quite a lot to be able to contribute into them. And so the sustainability of them is always called into question. So as much as you can kind of help them contribute and leave more than you've taken.
Just to finish on Peter's question there about on Peter's point, that I don't think you were saying that engineers are the problem. It's much more about how we focus their tasks. But he's made the point there that politicians and the media often don't appreciate the engineering world, and engineers are often sidelined for political decisions. I don't think that's
No, it's not the implication, but I think it's an important one, which I think, and with engineers in particular. So I do lots of work across kind of the whole of STEM, and I think with engineering in particular, yes, there is a skill. We do need engineers. Of course, we need engineers. The world would literally collapse in on itself if not for engineers and their engineering skills. But I think we have to understand that your value in what you're able to create. You need different types of disciplines to be able to create better. You're much more likely to win a Nobel Prize in the sciences if you've engaged with the arts as part of your upbringing. And so having that cross-disciplinary approach, having different types of people in your team, having different values and different inputs is very, very important. And we shouldn't get carried away and say engineering is the only way to solve these things, because it's not. It isn't. You can't just build it. It just doesn't work on its own. You need the other thing, right? You're not engineering for engineering's sake. Engineers solve problems and you build things, but you're not building them for engineers. You're building them for the others, right? For society and for world. And I think sometimes that balance gets tipped a little bit. I actually think it's part of why we have quite a big problem within engineering in itself, but that's another discussion for another day.
Another panel discussion. In the 4 or 5 minutes we've got left, maybe just to BSI comments first, just to give me a quick soundbite about what you see change in post-COVID and how look for something positive in terms of what we can do as the national standards body. Who'd like to go first?
You're talking to me. I'm sorry.
No, I'll start with BSI, Sadie and
Okay,
Dainton.
perfect,
Okay.
perfect. So,
I was just going to mention that today is the 60th anniversary of Consumers International, and next year will be the 70th anniversary of the Consumer and Public Interest Group, that network that started as the Women's Advisory Group 70 years ago in BSI. And the reason I point to that is because I think, where it's changing what BSI, we work, they're not just British standards, they're European international standards. And in my role, a lot of the work is working with consumers across the world. And I think following on from Anne-Marie and Stefan's comments about, that we need global solutions. We can't just fix it in the UK. And that's why it's really important that we not only work with consumers in the UK, but we work through our partners, through ISO Capolco, through Consumers International, to make sure that we're engaging all those different strands of consumers to feed into this work, to make sure that we do build back better, and it's better for consumers globally, not just in any individual region.
Yeah, so I would say that, I haven't mentioned, for example, things like net zero today, but we have a lot of standards which can help organisations on that journey in terms of net zero. But I suppose the one takeaway is probably to make sure that people don't view us as only being within the environment, social governance space, as being a provider of solutions for, quantification of greenhouse gas emissions. It's really important, obviously, but that's not all we can do or should do. And I think probably just picking up on the theme of this morning, it is those quote unquote soft indicators, the social governance, which I think will be working in tandem with the environmental indicators. And I think that's where BSI needs to be. It already is, but I think it needs to invest more in engagement with all the organisations we've been hearing about today, to make sure we can be seen as being a solution provider for all three of those areas: the environment, social and the governance.
Thank you, David. Stefan, before I bring in Anne-Marie to close, your view on how we take this forward? You're on mute.
there we go. For us, and obviously I am focusing on gender, because that's what we had in mind, but there's also the climate change and poverty, and it affects women and so on and so forth. So these elements are all linked. I think the objective is to find the way, or creative solutions that will allow us to harness that economic power of women, and so that they can drive the economic recovery. Leaders in the government and in companies need women right now. Their jobs are more vulnerable than in economic fallouts like from crises like this. But conversely, if you improve their working opportunities and income, you're talking quality of jobs, elimination of pay gap, etc., there is a huge potential to boost the wider economic recovery. So how do we get companies and governments to move on these issues? I think right now there's a notion that we don't have the choice. We're seeing the G20 in Saudi Arabia trying to encourage other governments to move the same way. We'll see after the weekend if they were successful. But I will definitely speak to David and other people at BSI to see how we can encourage companies to use standards to put in place these different. So my takeout is I've got work to do.
Thank you, Stefan. Anne-Marie, to close.
So I think my hope is that as we build better, I think I've really enjoyed this morning. I really enjoyed the debate. Really enjoyed kind of speaking to this community and seeing Stefan again. Hey, Stefan. I think my hope would be going forward that we're able to take kind of the body of standards that we have and allow them to evolve and actually be used by folks to kind of set those standards. I think there's quite a lot that's already being done. There's quite a lot of progress that's being made. The one thing we didn't actually talk about, so I know you've already started on, is things like the seatbelt standards. And I think like I said, there's a vacuum. So I feel like there's a lot of answers already in the room that we just need others to kind of have those on their desks. It's kind of in time or perfect timing that we need to have to say, okay, we've already got ISO, whatever it might be. We've already got this standard. We've already got that. So I think my hope would be that we're able to kind of re-up the work we've already done, for a time like this, to then help people build better with something we already had. So that's my hope.
Brilliant. Thank you for those positive messages. Thank you, David, Sadie. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Anne-Marie. That's excellent. Thank you all for your contributions this morning. This Zoom session will be ending shortly, but there is plenty more for you on today's agenda. Next up is the Knowledge Marketplace and visits with exhibitors, for those of you who've booked. If you haven't, feel free to visit the exhibitors' virtual stands, which are on the mobile app or on the web platform. From 12:30 to 1:30, there's a break for lunch, and then the next set of live conference sessions begin at 1:30 and run through till 4:30. We have 3 great sessions from our Building Back Better stream lined up this afternoon. They are organizational and community resilience, safe working practices during the pandemic, and how HR standards can help businesses adapt to the new working world. Thank you very much for joining our opening session, and we look forward to seeing you more at other sessions through this week of conferences. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, guys.